Good afternoon and welcome to today's installment of the Boost Your Skills webinar series, where we enlist the advice of specialist experts in order to help you make the most out of your university experience and to acquire the skills to help you succeed and develop both professionally and on a personal level. I'm Siddharth, and joining me is Jenny, and we are your Boost Your Skills team. This event is in webinar format, so you will not be able to turn on your cameras and mics, but we would still love to hear from you through the chat function. This is a safe space with no judgments being passed, so please feel free to ask questions without fear or worry. If you are still anxious, feel free to message Jenny or myself anonymously and we will pass it on. The webinar will be broken down into 4 chapters with a little time being allocated after each chapter for relevant questions, as well as some time at the end for Q&A. Alison and Mike will try to answer all your questions, but if we start running over time, then we will send you a document with the questions and their answers in the days following this session. The event is being live streamed to our YouTube channel, so don't worry if you've missed something. We will be sharing a link to the video and the slides after the event. Finally, thank you to all our attendees with pre-submitted questions. Now, I'd like to hand over to Maria from Sage Publishing.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. My name is Maria. I'm Marketing Manager for Study Skills at Sage. I'm really delighted to introduce you to our authors, Mike Wallace and Alison Ray. Mike is a professor of public management at Cardiff Business School at Cardiff University, where he teaches postgraduate courses on research methods. And Alison is research professor of language and communication at Cardiff University as well. She has a long-standing commitment to researcher training. Today's webinar will show you how to write a convincing literature review at postgraduate level and bring to life tried and tested tips from Mike and Alison's best-selling textbook, Critical Reading and Writing for Postgraduates, which is now in its 4th edition. So if you want to learn more, just scan this QR code. You'll also be able to get the book at a discounted price from John Smith Student Store. You might also find the book at your university library. That's all from me today. Now over to you, Mike.
Okay. Welcome to the webinar. Our aim is to explore how ideas in our postgraduate textbook and the accompanying online resource can help you develop your ability to write critical literature reviews where you can build a strong overall argument that will help you to convince your target academic readers to accept the claims that you're making about your research topic. The book is, as the title suggests, designed primarily for postgraduate students working at master's and doctoral levels who are studying, especially in the social sciences. And this is because in the social sciences, expert researchers may disagree over what's worth studying, how to study it, and why it should be done at all. And secondly, most postgraduate students are likely to be conducting and evaluating empirical research in their studies, often for a dissertation or a thesis. So our approach is focusing primarily on what we call frontline texts, such as academic journal articles or research monographs, where the authors are justifying and reporting their own work. Contrast this with support texts, such as textbooks, like our own, or textbooks on a particular research topic or encyclopedias, which tend to provide an overview, but they don't have space for including the justification supporting the claims that authors might be making. We also focus on not just describing, but evaluating authors' claims when reporting their research. They tend to claim that they've developed significant new knowledge about some aspect of the social world that will be of interest to you. You might wonder why it really matters to be critical in postgraduate work. The balloon on the right suggests you have assessors to think about. Most of your reading work is primarily directed, indirectly or directly, towards assessment. Your written work is what is assessed, and your assessors, who may be markers or examiners, are using various criteria for judging your work's quality. Here are 3 examples in use in my university, and you'll see that being critical comes up in each one. I'll give you a chance to read them. So it is an expectation. And being critical also matters after your postgraduate studies. It's a very widespread expectation in academic careers and in many other professional careers too. We're going to take a first look at what's in the textbook and the online resources. It comes in 3 parts, and the online resources support these 3 parts. In part 1, we look at what being critical means in academic inquiry and how being critical can help you decide what to read, how much depth to invest your time in investigating, studying the text, deriving it with your own study agenda, and writing a critical summary about what you've read, which is directly related to pursuing this study agenda. In part 2, we offer what we call a mental map of how and why authors discuss and study topics and how they develop their argument about what they've found out. And we also explore how to use the map to help you explore and evaluate in depth a text that's really central to your own study agenda, and then to write a critical review about what you've read based on the analysis you've done. In part 3, we focus on reviewing a potentially unlimited number of texts in developing a critical literature review, and then employing multiple critical literature reviews for a bigger piece of work, such as a dissertation or thesis, and also using critical literature reviews in other communication activities, such as research papers, conference presentations, and conference posters. And the online resources include templates, examples, and exercises to support the work introduced in parts 1 to 3. How does the book work? We offer a structured approach to critical reading and writing skills that builds on what you already know how to do. The chapters and the exercises progressively develop increasingly sophisticated strategies for critical reading and writing, which help you to become more systematic in your reading and give you more flexibility in translating what you've read into what you write, particularly for assessment by your target critical readers. It also develops long-lasting skills through practice using these structures. The more you practice, the more they become a habit, automatic. And once they are an intrinsic part of your way of thinking, you can then leave the structured sequence of strategies behind because you naturally think in a critically evaluative way. And this frees you up to employ the strategies selectively and flexibly to suit your own academic purposes. You're very much in charge of the way you engage critically with literature and the way you write about what you have read. Some key features of this structured approach: we provide 2 levels of critical engagement as you're reading a text like a journal article, 5 questions to guide your reading in summary, which are refined and expanded to 10 questions to guide critical reading in depth. And throughout, we link your role as a critical reader with your role as a self-critical writer, providing guidance on how to read critically, to think about what the critical readers of your work for assessment are looking for, and then considering how you can fulfill the needs and expectations of the critical readers of your work. We also offer different frameworks for using the results of your critical reading to write about a single text, several texts comparatively, and that potentially unlimited number of texts comparatively that is likely to come up in a critical literature review, in a dissertation, or a thesis. Our approach is underpinned by 4 core ideas. The idea that academic discourse in which you are taking part as a postgraduate student is two-way. Everybody is a reader and a writer. We consider what goes into making an argument convincing, because you need to convince your assessors of your argument. What it actually means to be critical in practice in your academic work, and how you can take charge of your work so that you can find your voice as a contributor to academic discourse through your writing. Core idea 1, readers and writers. As a reader, you evaluate. And as a writer, you aim to convince others to accept what you claim. So here you are as the critical reader. You're reading a piece of academic writing written by somebody else, and you evaluate how convincing their claims are, and you report your evaluations in your writing. And as a self-critical writer, you evaluate how convincing your own claims are about what you've read, the judgments you've made about the convincingness of that author's claims, because you need to convince your own academic critical readers of your work. Convincing argument? Well, to be convincing, we suggest authors must supply a convincing argument with basically 2 components. A conclusion, where the author makes claims to know something new that is the case, perhaps something that could be improved and how it could be done. And then the warranting, support for these claims, which draw on appropriate forms of evidence as the basis for this support. Plenty of places where that evidence might come from. Particularly important for you will be these areas. I'll single out one. If you're reading an article, say, by authors who've done their own empirical research, they'll have claims to make about what they found out, and the form of evidence that will support and so warrant their claims being accepted, their argument being convincing, will be what they report they actually did in order to generate the findings that they are claiming. And that's the kind of thing you can then be scrutinizing as a reader. So to make your argument convincing, or to be convinced of another author's claims, you need an adequate amount of appropriate forms of evidence. What does this all mean? Well, be careful about arguments. We can make an argument in a single sentence, and people often do. What we're most interested in is the overall argument in a major piece of work, whether a journal article or a book or a dissertation or thesis. So this overall argument comprises claims to new knowledge in the conclusion that are warranted by a literature review, maybe by empirical work. And then what does it mean to be critical in practice? Core idea 3. You have to decide whether you find other people's arguments convincing when you're reading. So you could be looking for their claims to knowledge and checking the warranting for an adequate amount of appropriate forms of evidence. So here's our writer of the text. And here's you asking questions as you read. And being a self-critical writer, thinking about what you make of the author's claims and whether they are adequately warranted by appropriate forms of evidence. And in this case, deciding that the evidence is inadequate to support the claim. But also, as that is now your claim, you need to warrant your claim with evidence taken from the text, which might perhaps show that, say, the sample was too small to support that level of generalization of a claim. Because your claims in your argument are going to be assessed by your critical academic reader, and you have to convince them about your argument. How to find your own voice means you've got to take charge of your work so that your own ideas generate the sorts of things you want to say in the light of your reading. So core idea 4, we suggest that as a critical reader, you take charge of what you read so you achieve your purpose. You're going to do these sorts of things: clarifying, searching, identifying the most useful texts, and then deciding how much investment to make in reading them, reading your texts, and then taking notes on how it helps you to achieve your purpose. So you are driving the reading. It's what's relevant to you. And then as a self-critical writer, you take charge. So you find your own voice as an authoritative and persuasive communicator within academic discourse. You have to make a decision about when you've done enough reading, and then develop your overall argument about your topic. And you need to warrant your conclusion about what you've read with an adequate amount of appropriate evidence, which is going to come from the literature that you've read, and possibly other literature that you can turn to. And that way you'll give your critical academic reader confidence that you're methodical and attentive in your work and not haphazard in what you read and what you report. So here's your chance to ensure that you take charge of the literature and it doesn't end up taking charge of you and you get drowned in trying to report everything you've ever read. The literature is just a resource for pursuing your agenda. In the rest of the presentation, we're going to take a slightly deeper second look at each of these parts of the book. But next, it's time for some questions and answers. So I'll stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Mike, for that. If you would like to put a question to Mike on what you've just heard, please put that into the Q&A. In the meantime, while we're just waiting for that to come up, there's a question. We were sent some questions in advance by participants. And so I'm going to just mention one of those because I thought it might be useful. Somebody wrote in and said, could you provide 5 tips for being self-critical? And the key thing I think we'd say here, from now you've heard what Mike has said, is that it's not about quick tips in a way. This is about learning an approach that will integrate a number of different skills together around those 4 core ideas that he mentioned, that reading and writing work together all the time. You're being a critical reader and writer at the same time, that you need to look for how convincing an argument is by looking at the quality of the warranting of the claim, that you need techniques for how to identify the claims and evaluate them. And that's what the book is about. That's the core element of the book. And then you need to find your voice so that you use the literature in a way that helps you to develop your own account for your research. So the most important tip, if you like, is to have a method. Because that is how you will become confident that you're being effective and that you're developing your critical insights. And it will take time. This is a big investment, but it will give you big returns. If you learn how to use a technique, it doesn't have to be ours, but a technique of some kind, that will give you the confidence that you know what you're doing, and that will make a massive difference. Okay, we've had a question come in, a couple of questions come in. Let me just have a quick look what they are. I've got a question from Amel Mike saying, for a PhD thesis, do you think that using others' research papers is better than using books?
I think my response to that will be, well, it all depends on your agenda. You're in charge, or we hope you put yourself in charge. I'm wondering if what lies behind the question might be a concern that frontline texts that are journal articles have survived a peer review process, and so they must be of high quality. And maybe a book, which is like to be a bigger piece of work, may not have survived this same peer review process and may not be such high quality. But actually, I don't think a review process is what makes something of high quality. And in the social science, certainly, expert researchers disagree on what makes for good quality. And so you have to take charge in the end, I think, and consider your purposes, what you are trying to find out, and then go to any source that could help you, but be very aware of how the source may have come to be written. So an advantage of looking at other people's research articles is they tend to be hard but short. They're not hugely long, and it's usually quite quick to identify their main claims to new knowledge that might be relevant to you, and then to work out whether you're fully convinced of what they're claiming. A book's a bit different matter because it's bigger, but of course, what a book can do, the authors get a chance to discuss, analyze, critique a much bigger topic. And so as a reader, you might actually have a lot more in a book that's relevant to your research agenda than in any one article. So I'd say check both. Alison suggested some ways, we only had a brief chance to do this, about, or will be suggesting this, about ways of looking, if you like, in summary at something quickly in order to determine whether you're going to invest much more time in it. You don't have to read the whole of a book to realize it wasn't very useful for you, or it was. So there are ways of sort of helping yourself in on that, and we cover a lot of that in the book.
Thanks, Mike. I've got time for one more question. I think we've got several come in, and they're great questions, so we will keep a note of those and deal with those later. Okay, so somebody has asked, I find contradictory claims on the same subject from different authors in different articles. How can I be critical in this case to reach a conclusion?
What a super question. Yes, I think certainly in the social sciences, that is an absolutely typical experience, whether as a student or as an academic, because expert researchers may disagree on pretty well everything that we do in the social sciences. So the best way, I think, through this is to do a lot of the critical checks that we'll be talking about or introducing briefly in the remaining parts of this presentation, so that you can come to your own evaluation of how convincing you think the different authors are. So you may be looking at text one and you agree with the author. You need to know why. because you're going to have to justify why you think that author is convincing in the claims they make. Go to Article 2, contradictory claims. You're not convinced that they're so if you like, that they're right. You're going to have ground, if you like, or evidence to support whatever claims you want to make about rejecting that one. So in a way, this is part of the excitement, I think, of having an agenda and having the opportunity to engage critically with a range of literature on a topic that you're passionate about. You come across people making contradictory claims in different texts, and your opportunity is to kind of work out where you stand and then justify it. And that's exactly what you would be doing in a critical literature review for a master's dissertation and also for a PhD thesis.
Thanks, Mike. That's really helpful. I'll just add to that, that one of the techniques that I advise my students with, when you've got several different authors who are making contradictory claims on the same topic, is to imagine that you had them all sitting in a room with you with a cup of tea, and you said, well, I'm trying to find out about this. How come you guys disagree? And see whether you can figure out from the things that they've written on what basis they would be likely to disagree. For example, that they are doing things in slightly different ways, did them in different places at different times, and so on. See if you can tease apart why it might be that their results and their claims disagree with each other. I think it's time we move on now. I've made a note of the other questions that have come up. I hope all of them. And there's some terrific questions there. Some of them will get answered in what happens next, but I've kept a note of them so we can address them in writing later if we don't get to them later. Thanks. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, and then I will proceed with the second part of the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a little bit more of what's in part 1 of the book. Mike's given you a general overview, so I don't need to go into great detail here. He'd already explained what we cover in chapter 1, if you like, which is the introduction to what it means to be critical. So you've heard a lot of that from Mike just now. And then the second chapter goes into quite a lot of detail about the different types of texts you might come across and how to decide which ones to read and in how much depth, and the different pros and cons of different types of research literature. The third chapter is one that we added in later editions, and we think is really rather effective, which is to practice your critical thinking skills by looking at the abstracts of articles, because in abstracts you get the claims, but there isn't space for them to give the warranting. And so if you just work with the abstract, it gives you practice in figuring out what sorts of warranting you would want in order to accept that claim. So it sets you up before you read the article to know what sorts of things you'd be looking for. Chapter 4 is the introduction to our particular technique for critical reading, and it suggests using 5 critical questions that you can take to the text that you're reading. And if you answer those questions, you will have got out of it the key information you need. And I'll show you how that works in just a minute. And then chapter 5 shows how you can use the answers to those questions to write something that is a self-critical piece of writing, so you know that it is robust to other people reading your work. And then we move on from there to show how you can use several different articles, but where you've got the answers to the 5 critical questions, and you can combine them so that you write a rather more integrated account of the literature that isn't just one after another. And then the final chapter in that part gives some tips on writing skills that will help to ensure that your writing is more convincing in the way that it's presented. So what I'm going to do now is to just talk a little bit about what's in chapters 4, 5, and 6, because that's the core of our method. And so, as I say, what we introduce are 5 synopsis questions. And the key thing here is that you can read an article relatively quickly and pull out the main information that you need in order to make an assessment of that work. And the first question you need to ask is, why am I reading this? This is really important because it's so easy to just pick up the next thing that's on the list that's in your folder or whatever, and you end up reading it and you think, well, I don't know what I read that for, really. So if you ask yourself why I'm reading, what am I looking for, that will ensure that you prioritize reading the work that is most likely to be useful to you. The second question that we ask, B, is what are the authors trying to achieve in writing this? And this might not be a question you've really thought about before. You just thought, well, they've written it, so I should read it. But what are they trying to achieve? And this is important because authors have different purposes for writing. They have their own agendas. They might be trying to just report something they found out because they think it's interesting, but they might actually be trying to argue that some policy or some practice should change. So they've got an agenda there. And associated with that, they will have certain assumptions and they will carry certain values with them in that. And if you are aware of what they're trying to achieve and what their assumptions and values might be, that will help you to recognize the kinds of claims they're likely to make and why they will warrant them in the way that they do. And that gives you a lot more insight into what's going on in that article. The third question that's really important, obviously, if you're going to evaluate the claims, you've got to figure out what the claims are. So you're looking for what are the authors claiming here, but you're focusing on the things that they're claiming that are relevant to your own work. So it goes back to, why am I reading this? And this ensures that you don't get distracted by things that an author may put into their article because they're following their agenda that are not relevant to what you want to do. The fourth question then is the one that's evaluative. So how convincing are these claims and why do I find them convincing? And this is important because the purpose of a literature review is that it creates a platform from which you can justify why you're doing your own empirical work. This is worth doing for my empirical work because of what other people have done in the past. And so it's really important that you can distinguish where things that have been claimed in the past are actually reliable and convincing versus a bit dodgy and perhaps not very reliable. If everything is not very reliable, that might give you scope to develop something new yourself in your own empirical work. But if people are making claims and they're not all that reliable, you might not want to rest too much reliability on that when you design your own work. And then the fifth question, E, is, in conclusion, what use can I make of this? And this is really important because you make a note related to why you were reading it that tells you what you're coming out from reading this, knowing, and how you're going to use this, so that you don't just read it, put it on the pile, and then you don't really know what you're going to do with it. You have a note about, I will use it for this purpose when it comes to it. So let me show you how that can be used in practice. What I'm going to do is imagine that you've picked up an article and it's because you're trying to answer a question, which is that you want to find out, why am I reading this? To find out more about a particular teaching method that we'll call X because of the space. And so you're perhaps reading a number of different articles that are going to help you find out about this teaching method. So that's the answer to your question A. When you start looking at the article and you want to answer question B, you see that what they're doing is they're challenging the assumption that X is actually an effective teaching method, which perhaps is quite surprising because you thought that everybody was going to say it was a great teaching method. So you've discovered that they are challenging that assumption in what they claim. So you carry on and you see, what do they actually claim? And you find that they observed 3 different methods in their research, but only one of them is actually about X. So you can set the other 2 aside. And what they claim about this method X is that it wasn't effective. But what you've got to do in your notes is to give examples of evidence of why they thought it was not effective. What did they say was the reasons? How did they measure it? How did they know that it wasn't effective? And that then gives you the way in to be able to evaluate the claims that they make in answering question D. So you look at the evidence that they offer for why this method isn't very effective, and you think actually that evidence is quite limited, that it's of low effect. They haven't got a lot to offer there. So perhaps they've overinterpreted what they've got. And again, you write down examples of what you've found, maybe quotes from their own text, so that you can back up why you think that those claims are not very convincing. And then it comes to the point with, in conclusion, what use can I make of this? And you might come to the conclusion that, wow, because this is actually challenging X, and not many articles I've come across so far do that, this is going to be really useful. I can get a great discussion now about whether X is good or not, because this is a pivotal one. Even though it's of limited use, it does actually raise some interesting questions. So now we can think about what it would look like if you wrote that up. And let's imagine that in this case, somebody's asked you to write a critical summary of a single text, or in a larger piece of work, you've chosen to dedicate a whole paragraph or couple of paragraphs to just describing this one text. So the first thing you might do is in your report structure is you want to draw something that relates to why you were reading it. So you want to make it clear that this is about teaching method X, but you can actually do something more focused here because it's a single article and you already know that it challenges the effectiveness. So you might say, what I want to do now is to consider whether X is actually an effective method. So you've used your information from answer A. Now you're going to draw on answer B. And what you're going to say is that this author aimed to find out if X worked well in practice. Well, you know the answer. They're going to claim that it didn't. So you're setting up a nice account that gets the reader interested. Now you're going to report what the author claims, and note that there's no need probably to mention the other two methods unless you really think that that is relevant. You can just go straight to talking about her observations of X and how she found that that indicated limited effectiveness. Importantly then, for example, you've got to show in your report why you know that that's what she claimed. So that's where you pull out some quotes or some summaries of what she's claimed. When it comes to D, now you're going to write about why you think that evidence is perhaps a little limited, because that's your view. You say, however, her evidence is quite limited and it might have been overinterpreted. That's your claim. Now, how are you going to warrant that? By filling in with, for instance, and then you're going to go back again and you're going to bring out key information that she has said. You might quote her, and that's how you will demonstrate that you feel that perhaps there isn't enough evidence. You might say she's only given 2 quotes herself, or her graph doesn't show that there's very much difference, whatever it might be, that warrants your claim that that evidence is limited. And then to draw it to a close, you might think, well, I've now got to decide, does that limited evidence mean I can't make any use of it, or can I do something with it? And you might say something like, although limited, this study reminds us not to assume that this method is effective without checking for evidence from practice. So I want to then show what you can do when you've read several texts, and you can then write something a little bit more integrated. And I should mention here that in the book and also online on the resources, one of the templates is a sheet which has these 5 questions on it, and underneath each question is a box that you can type in, and it will expand so you can put as much into it as you want. And what that means is that you can generate a little text for yourself, a little document for yourself that gives the answers to each of these questions for that particular article. And that means to say that you can then take the answers that you've got for several different articles, and you can line them up on your screen or print them out and put them on your desk and read across. And the key thing here is that it works really well if you have the same answer to question A for all of the things you're trying to write about together, because it shows that you came in looking for the same thing. So you had your eye in for the same things. But of course, the answers are going to be different for B, C, D, and E for each of these articles. And you can then read across and see what information you've got about each one so that you can write more integratedly. So let me show you how that works. You might start off using A, just saying regarding teaching method X. So you're just telling your reader, this is what I'm talking about. So you've given signposting immediately. And then you're going to draw on your answers to B, and you might note that authors 2 and 3, of course, you'd name the authors with their dates. You wouldn't just put authors 2 and 3. I'm just doing that because it's shorter. Authors 2 and 3 focus on policy, and author 1 focus on practice. So they're achieving different kinds of things. They're trying to talk about this topic in slightly different ways. And that might be relevant because it might affect the kinds of things that they claim. You then go down to your answers to C, where you're seeing what they claim. And what I've done here is to take the key claims from authors 2 and 3. And I say authors 2 and 3 see this method as being central to effective learning. So that's what you've drawn from your answers. And they claim this. And this is where you put in the warranting that demonstrates why you know that they claim this. You might then go down to question D, how convincing, just for authors 2 and 3, because you're already talking about them. And you might say, well, the author 2's evidence is weakened by such a limitation. And you then go into some detail on that. And then you might say an author 3's study is a little narrow in focus, for example. And again, you warrant your claims that that is the situation by explaining how you know that. Then you might go back up to question C for article 1, the one we looked at before. And you might then say, in contrast, author 1's evidence suggests that X is not effective in practice. Whoa, that's really interesting. You've got that clash there now. And so you've now, and you would then explain why there. And then you would go down to evaluating it. And you'd say, however, the data is maybe a little bit overinterpreted. And as before, you will go into detail about how you know that and how robust you feel your own claim about that is. And then you get to the end of your report and you'll be saying, well, pulling across the different ways in which I can use this information, you might say, if author 1's findings were more convincing, they might challenge current policy. There we are, you've got a really nice conclusion there. Future stronger studies could establish if there is cause for concern. So you've come out of it saying something useful that brings together and comments on those things jointly. Okay, it's time for another set of question and answers, so I will just stop sharing my screen now.
Right, while Alison's doing that, I'm going to relay a question that came up before the presentation that was sent in earlier. My supervisor criticized me for writing about one article first, then the next, and so on. How should I solve this problem? So someone's writing about one thing at a time, and the critical reader of their work is saying, this isn't really very good. Let's look back or remind ourselves of Alison's last slide she just presented on how you can create a comparative critical summary. And if you think about the example she gave, she was comparing and contrasting her 3 texts and what the authors were claiming and whether they were warranted claims and so on. Comparing and contrasting is more effective, I think, than reviewing one text at a time, because it gives you more rewards. As you build up that comparative review, as Alison did, it builds you more comparative insights about all the text together, because you're always engaging in your writing up with all the text together. So you build up your account through those comparative insights that spring out as you look across. Then you can turn your comparative insights into your claims in your conclusion about all the text you've read taken together. And that comparative account that you've built up provides the evidence from your own reading that warrants your claims about what you've read and helps to make them convincing to your target reader. So this is why we advocate working across text comparatively in the way that Alison illustrated, rather than ending up with a whole series of texts written about individually and then having a huge task at the end to sort of come up with a conclusion that actually is about all the text taken together. So a great advantage of building it up as you go along. Alison, here's one question that has come up.
Yeah.
It's all about voice, and I think you probably could refer to this because it was implicit in your presentation. How exactly do you find and emphasize your voice in the midst of the diverse voices in all those literatures studied? If your own voice has to be backed up by others' writers' views, so how is it then still your voice? What is it about you?
That's a really good question. I think it is something that develops over time. I found that with PhD students, and I mean, master's students, of course, first, but even with PhD students, when they start off, it's really, really quite hard to write with authority because you just feel like everybody else knows more than you do. And so who are you to have a view on this? But actually, over time, as you engage critically with the literature, what starts to happen is that you get these insights about how things interact with each other, because you're the first person who's actually looked at that precise subset of literature and evaluated it in the way you have, with your review questions leading to what you want to do in your research. And that is what makes your work yours. And because that's original, because that is something which you've come up with and it is emerged out of the insights you have from the research literature, you start to find that you actually do have not just opinions in the sense of I think this or whatever, but backed up opinions, because you know, backed up views, you can make claims because you know what other people have said, and you start to get a sense about the relative convincingness of different things, in the same way as you would if you were an experienced versus less experienced user of a piece of software or some other piece of kit. Over time, as you use it more, you become more authoritative about what the pros and the cons are and how it works and so on. So it's something that builds up over time. So don't worry about that.
Great, thank you very much. I think it's time to move on. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. So now we're going to look at the chapters in part 2. The first 4 chapters introduce what I've already mentioned as a mental map for helping yourself to navigate the literature and outline each of the 5 components. So you build up that map. Then the next 2 chapters help you with engaging critically with a text in considerable depth. And in the online resources, there's a template there which you can use to help you do that. Then, just as we did with part 1, we give you some guidance on how you can build on all the analysis you've worked for one text or multiple texts, done that work in depth. And so ideas are there about how you could structure a critical review of a single text or a critical review of a few texts that are informed by the in-depth critical analysis work you've already done. We're going to look at the mental map and developing a critical analysis of a text. A little more detail now. The mental map. This is to help you with your scrutiny of text and also to help you be self-critical in your own work. As you start reading a text, you're going to be interested in what's new. So you can be looking for claims to knowledge, new knowledge, and they will have a couple of characteristics. The author will express a degree of certainty or tentativeness about what they found out, and a degree of generalization from whatever settings they might be studying to other settings. So that'll be what's new. Then you might well be thinking, so why did the author do this? Because the chances are that the claims they've made will reflect their reasons for studying this topic and for trying to make some sort of impact through the publications that you're now writing. And from there, their reasoning is likely to be informed by the way they've framed the study, the kind of thinking that's gone on before they even get as far as, well, I know now why I'm going to do this study. So how's it being framed? And authors, whether explicitly or implicitly, will be reflecting particular ways of thinking about the social world. One key area where expert researchers may disagree, and they will need to use various tools for thinking in order to conceptualize, to articulate in language what they mean. And that is the sum total of the mental map. Let's look at each of the components a little bit more. Start with claims to knowledge. I think you're very familiar with this notion in our work now. Authors claim to have found something out about the social world, or perhaps in a methodological paper, even something new about how to study it. And these characteristics are, in terms of certainty, how sure the authors are about what they've found out in the settings they've investigated. And then the degree of generalization, how widely do they think what they think they found out in those settings applies to other settings, maybe some other settings, or potentially all other settings in the world that are like it in some way. The reasons for studying, trying to make an impact. We're looking here at why did these authors do this study? What traces can we find in the article that we might be reading of what we might consider as their intellectual project, the thing they're trying to do to perhaps guide improvement in policy, or to deepen academic understanding or something. And because they'll have a certain purpose in what they're doing, that's likely to generate the sort of claims that they make about what they found out. Ways of thinking are assumptions which are often not made explicit, but they're very detectable within most texts that I've ever come across. The authors inevitably make certain assumptions about the nature of the social world, what exists, and how we can have knowledge about the social world, epistemology. And they'll also have values. A value may be the value of impartiality. I am neutral, but that's still a value. Other people will have values that actually are about, let's say, the ethics of the work, of the way research is done, and values about particular topics. So an author might regard a particular social phenomenon as wrong, and therefore in need of eradication or improvement. That's all axiology. Those ways of thinking will have an impact on the reasons for studying, and therefore on the claims that authors likely to make. And finally, the tools for thinking. We have to communicate through language. So this is all about the ways authors conceptualize the social world, interpret it through language, and investigate it using concepts, maybe putting them together in various ways, particularly in theories. And those ways of conceptualizing the social world will have an impact on the kind of claims they then make about it. So there again, we have the map introduced very briefly in summary, and obviously, should you be interested in the book, it's developed in much more detail, and there are exercises to help you interrogate a text you're interested in and actually look for all these things in it. Let's move on to developing a critical analysis of a text before we see how the mental map can help you with it. Alison introduced the critical synopsis, the 5 questions. Quick reminder about the rationale. Taking charge by following your study agenda. Looking at what the authors actually are doing and why they're doing it. Identifying not any old claims in their argument, but the relevant claims in their overall argument to your study agenda. and evaluating these claims by assessing any relevant evidence to them that warrants the claims. And finally, in the light of that, deciding how you're going to use the result of your critical engagement for your agenda, which might be anything from you're going to use this, cite this as support for the claims you want to make, all the way through to you're going to reject this as unconvincing. In both cases, you need to be able to warrant the claims you make. The critical analysis takes the same rationale, but goes in much more detail. So it takes longer to do, but it gives you a much more in-depth understanding of the strengths and limitations of the, let's say, journal article or book that you're engaging critically with. So it's probably only worth doing for texts which you find are absolutely central to your area of interest. An example might be a PhD thesis where you actually want to take somebody else's research as your starting point, and you're very approving about what they've done. So you need to justify why it's worth doing, or going the other way. You might say, this is very unconvincing way to study the topic, and I want to go in a different direction. You'll need to explain why, and you have to explain why, therefore, the person's work isn't good enough for the job. First of all, you explore the text. So why am I reading this becomes much more specific. What review question am I asking of this text? That helps you to focus in on seeking an answer or a contribution to answering your review question as you go through the text in depth. What are the authors trying to achieve? A little more sophisticated, separating out how are they trying to do it and why are they doing it? What are they claiming that's relevant to my work? More sophisticated again in the fact that there are now two questions. And the new one is really looking at those characteristics. How certain and generalized are the author's claims? Once you've done that exploration, you can then use the information you've got to support your evaluation. Coming up now. How convincing are these claims and why? Where we gave you no specific guidance on what to look for. Very different now. Up to 5 things we suggest you can look for, which are covered in considerable depth in the textbook. You could ask the question, how adequate is the backing for these claims? If it's empirical backing, let's look at the research methods. Let's look at the sample. Let's look at the way the data were analyzed and see if they're adequate to support the claims being made. Then we could also look at this framing. If they perhaps used a theoretical orientation to guide the work, how does it link, or how consistently does it link with the claims that are being made at the end? And even if they don't use a theoretical orientation, they can't avoid using concepts. So you can always be looking at the way they are defining their key concepts, or perhaps failing to do so. To what extent are claims supported or challenged by other work? That's very important. Although you are looking at one text at a time, and you're looking at this one in depth, your authors are likely to be warranting some of their claims by reference to other authors' work. And you will know of other authors' relevant work as you continue your own studies and you build up a background. So you can ask, to what extent are the claims supported or challenged by others' work? And then sometimes, if you have your own relevant experience from being a citizen in the social world, and perhaps a professional and so on, if you have relevant experience, you can ask, to what extent are claims consistent with this experience that I have? Does that sound feasible to me? Your experience is clearly very limited, but it's also very deep. And so it's a very good base point for you to consider. I would certainly not rule it out. And then in conclusion, what use can I make of this? More specifically now, you're looking to see what contribution your analysis offers you in relation to that review question that's keeping you focused all the way through. And that's perhaps the key thing for you to take away from this, how more sophisticated and differentiated the various checks are that you can make. And there's certainly lots of support in the textbook and the materials for doing that. Got to bring the old mental map back in. So that's what it is. And now let's go to those critical analysis questions. I'll whiz through this rather quickly, but I'll highlight 2 or 3 points where I can actually illustrate for you how you can use the mental map. Should you use the textbook, you'll get lots more guidance on all of this. So you're exploring, off we go. You could be considering the author's ways of thinking, reasons for studying. So for example, their reasons for studying. You could be checking this. What are the author's values about the topic they're investigating? And who are they seeking to inform or to influence? On we go. The claims, they will reflect the author's tools for thinking, their ways of thinking, their assumptions and so on. And the claims to knowledge, of course, will be quite specific there. How certain, generalized are the author's claims? You're highlighted in the mental map to look at that directly. For example, you could be asking, how certain are the authors about what they found out in the settings they investigated? And how widely do they generalize their claims to other settings? That's really nice because that sets you up for what's coming next. Evaluation. How adequate is the backing for claims? Think of what we've just said about those characteristics. You could ask, do the authors have enough empirical evidence, if they've done empirical research, for the degree of certainty and the generalization of their claims to be convincing? More evaluation, another check. Theoretical orientation. Bound to use tools for thinking. Are the concepts defined? You could be checking. Is there grouping together? If it is into some kind of model or theory, is it coherent? Do they all fit together? Value stance. To what extent does it affect claims? There'll be the underlying axiological assumptions, the ways of thinking, and the reasons for studying and trying to make a difference, values about the topic. Support or challenge from others' work will reflect the author's tools for thinking, the ways of thinking and their claim characteristics. That'll be not just your authors, but the authors whose work they refer to. Your own experience, again, you could consider the claim characteristics. If somebody is generalized, sometimes people generalize very widely by putting nothing in to qualify their claims, implying that they are universally applicable across the social world. Well, if that's what they're doing, then they're implicitly implying that these claims apply to you. And so you can use your own experience to see if those claims are consistent with yours. And then you finish off. So the mental map has a really powerful use in helping you focus in on analyzing your text in depth using these exploratory and evaluatory questions to help you. And then, though I can't deal with it right now in this presentation, you'll be given guidance on how to use the outcome of that analysis as the starting point for writing an in-depth critical review of that text, or if you've done several of these analyses, comparatively across multiple texts. Time for more questions and answers, so I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Mike. Just looking at the time so that we don't overrun too far, we've got some really, really good questions have come up. One or two of them, I have to admit, I wouldn't want to answer on the fly. I think we need to to think about them. They're really, really good questions that will make us think. And there are a few I've identified that we hopefully can pick up perhaps after my presentation when we've got, I hope, a little bit more time for questions. So I'm going to suggest that we move straight on for now. And so I will share my screen and we'll just carry on with the final part. So what I'm going to look at now is just giving you a little taster of what's in part 3, the final part of the book, where having had the introductory approach and that very complex middle section that Mike's just described with the mental map and the 10 questions, we see how you can put that to work to creating a convincing literature review. And so the chapters here are first of all, looking at focusing and building up your literature review using these questions, and then integrating the literature reviews into your dissertation. So how do you create a literature review, and then how do you put it into your dissertation so that it works effectively for you? And then looking at how we put critical literature reviews into different types of dissertation structure, because not all dissertations have the same structure. Some useful tools that are really about how to design your dissertation. Of course, the literature review is part of it, but this just focuses a bit to help you on making sure that the dissertation itself is an effective way to present an argument that is adequately warranted. And then we have a little bit on literature reviews in research papers, which of course are shorter than a dissertation or a thesis, and also oral presentations and posters, where there's not a lot of space for the literature, but it still has to be there. So some guidance on that. A little bit more in the final chapter on writing skills, a little bit more advanced than the one we had in chapter 7. And then at the end, a glossary, which is useful for a lot of those technical terms. And the appendices are really important, because in the appendices are 2 complete research articles. And these are the ones that we refer to when we do our extended examples of what it looks like to answer those questions and to write that up as a piece of text. So there's a worked example, or the more than one worked example in the book. And so you can read the original article so you can see what it is that we are commenting on. So we hope that is rather useful for you. And I should mention also that in the online resources, there are additional examples with published articles that you can read, and then you can see how we have developed elements of a critical literature review in response to certain kinds of, some of the questions out of the 10. Okay. So I'm going to focus just quickly on what's in chapters 15 and 16 to how you build up your critical literature review and integrate it into your dissertation. So the first thing to think about is that a critical literature review is made up of answers to several different review questions. And so I'm just going to talk about how you address one review question at the moment, and you might have a number of those in your literature review. So the first thing you're going to do in writing your little bit of literature review is you're going to give an introduction, explain what you're trying to do, identify your review question. This is addressing that answers to 1 and to A, you know, the why am I reading this? Why am I telling you about this? Giving your signposting for your readers so they know what you're up to. And then the rest of that part of the literature review, answering that review question, is made up, as you would expect, of an argument at the end, which is the conclusion. These are the things you come out of about what the answer to your review question is, and that is built up by giving the warranting for your argument. And the way you're going to do that is by, first of all, introducing the reader to which text you are talking about. So that is describing what the studies are and how and why they were done, which is the answer to question 2 in the critical analysis. And insofar as you've also got some notes for just the 5 questions, the A to E, because you haven't gone into as much detail, that's your answer to question B. So you can put these templates alongside each other, and you've got the answer to 2 and the answer to B, and you can put them alongside and draw them in together. Then when it comes to the next part of your warranting, it's about presenting what the main claims are that are relevant to your review question. And here you've got the answer to question C for the text that you've looked at more peripherally that I described earlier. And then for the ones that you've looked at in much more detail, where you've really dug in and you've got much more to say, that's the answers to questions 3 and 4. And you can integrate those by mentioning a lot about one study and then just mentioning in another sentence a more peripheral study and as you need to. Then it comes to the evaluation, and this is where you've got 5 answers, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 answers to help you evaluate the claim. So you can see how that really gets you a lot of depth and detail. And it's the equivalent of answering question D in the critical synopsis questions, but it gives you much more different ways to go there. And of course, as I mentioned before, you don't necessarily present all of the answers to 3, 4, and C first, and then do 5 to 9 and D. You can integrate those so that you mention a claim and you evaluate it before you move on. That's up to you. And then here you have your conclusion of your argument, which is your answer to your review question. So you can see how very focused that is going to be, and your reader will know exactly what it is that you've been doing. And then after at the end of all that, you've got the references. And the references are an important part of your warranting. That's why supervisors go on and on and on about your referencing being complete and being accurate. Because when you make a statement and you put in brackets a reference, that is you doing a kind of warranting of why you think that this claim that you've just made is the case. And therefore, it's important that the reader can see what those references are to get a sense about what sorts of grounds you are using for warranting your claims. Okay, so that was how you answer a particular review question, but how many review questions will go into a literature review? And that's actually a question that came up in the Q&As just a while back. And the answer to that is there is no answer to that. It depends on what you're trying to do. So it's as many as you need to keep your account clear and logical. You choose, in other words, this is up to you. You articulate your review questions and you answer them to keep in charge of the way you tell your story. Another thing you might wonder is, does all the literature reviewing go into one place? We're all very familiar with that kind of general structure where the literature review is kind of like a lump early on in your work. And some people think, oh, I'll get the literature review out the way so I can do the real work, the really interesting stuff. The literature review is part of your warranting for the conclusions you will make at the end. Now, we see it like that. And of course, there is going to be a big literature review section quite early on in your dissertation, but you don't have to put all of your reviewed literature into the same place. Put it where it works for you. It often helps to put different bits of literature review in different places. A classic example is if you've got a methodology chapter and you're going to be talking about what methodology you chose and why, it makes sense to review literature that you have looked at about the methodology. Which methodology should I use might be your review question. And then it makes sense to put that literature review there where it's needed and not put it somewhere else where the reader is going to say, whoa, hang on, why are you telling me this now? Put it where the reader needs it. So what you might have for your dissertation, if you look down the left-hand side of the green column, this is really a simple design of a dissertation or thesis. They're not all like that, and we cover other structures in the book. But essentially, you've got an introduction that explains what you're doing in your dissertation or thesis. You've got that big lumpy literature review chapter. And note here, I'll just go down. Then you've got the research design, where you say what you did, your findings, discussion, and then you end up with the conclusion, which is the claims you make, and they are warranted by what's gone before. Now look at that on the right-hand side, every single section of that dissertation might have some sort of literature review or reference to it. You know that very often in the introduction to something, you have to refer to a bit of literature just to set the scene. So there's already literature reviewing going on there. In the main literature review part of your dissertation or thesis, you're going to have, as I say, different review questions that you're addressing. Some of them will be on the research topic itself. There may be others that are on the theoretical orientation. How do people go about doing this? How do people perceive what they're doing is what I mean. And how are you going to conceptualize what you're doing? And a lot of people will actually split their literature review into 2 chapters. I usually recommend that for my students, so it doesn't get too long. So you have 2 different literature reviews, one on research and one on the topic, and one on the theoretical orientation. Now, when it comes to the research design, this is where, as I mentioned, you might have literature review around the methodology and the methods. So what have other people done, and did it work very well? Because that obviously is going to make a difference to what you decide you're going to do. That's your warranting for why you're doing what you're doing. And then when it comes to findings and discussion, you're going to be referring back to what you said in the literature review chapter or chapters, because you want to show how your own findings link back and make sense of or challenge what has been found before. And then in the conclusion, again, because it's the claims and you are warranting them with what's gone before, you will be referring back to the reviews to warrant that. So just to sum up what we've been saying here, what we wanted to demonstrate to you, first of all, was that you can't separate out these 2 different parts of your identity as an academic. You are both reading other people's work in a critically evaluative way, trying to figure out when they make their claims, how convincing those claims are in the context of what you're trying to find out. But you are also at the same time trying to make sure that when other people, including examiners, read your work, because they put their critical hat on, are going to find your work convincing. And so you've got to think ahead and get into their heads and figure out what they will be looking for and make sure that that's there. What we've tried to show is that you can't possibly read everything, and you can't possibly read everything in massive depth. There's a question that came up earlier on about what you do with a master's dissertation. You've got limited time. How can you do all of this work? It's so much of it. And so what we've tried to show is that you can combine the more in-depth critical analysis of maybe just 3 or 4 different texts that are really, really central to what you're doing. Combine that with a rather quicker way through of the questions A to E, where you read something and you immediately can pull out the key information you need. And actually what a lot of people will do is with anything they read, they start off doing the quick way with the 5 questions A to E. But if they realize in the course of doing that there's a lot of really important information and that they could use and could go into more depth with, they will put as their answer to E, what use can I make of this? They might, I need to go back and do a full in-depth critical analysis of this one. And there you know that you can then go and find all the ones that say that, and then you can add more information to that. And we've suggested that by combining the answers to 1 to 10 from the in-depth critical analyses with the answers to A to E from the summary ones, you can create an effective literature review, which very usefully foregrounds the things that you have done done in most depth, and background some of the other things without it simply being as background. There have been some other studies on this, and you just put a load of references, which doesn't tell the reader anything. You can at least say something about those things, even if it's just in a sentence or 2. And then we've tried to show that you don't just have one literature review in your dissertation or thesis. You might have several in different places, all playing their own role to create the narrative that you want to create. And that is how you pull together an overall successful critical literature review in your dissertation or thesis. Okay, thank you. So just a reminder, in case you've forgotten, that that's the book, but we'll now go into some more Q&A, and I will stop the share, but I'll keep that up for later on in case you want that, Maria. Okay.
Right, we've time for just a couple of questions. This is really a good one, I think, to respond to. Any advice on how to write a cohesive text, as he's getting to the writing, how to write a cohesive text that expresses our argument? I'm guessing that's in the light of what we've reviewed. It's about getting a coherent argument, I think. that will convince your academic critical readers?
That is a really good question. I think it's something that we find as supervisors, we spend a lot of time working with students on, and it's something that develops over time. And I think it does come down to being really, really organized, so that you know what it is you want to say, and you've got some sort of sense of the order in which you want to say it. Because the biggest difficulty with writing something which is that fits together, is cohesive, and is also coherent for the reader, so that the reader can make sense of it, is that as you're writing, you're not entirely sure where you're going, and you're trying it out. And this is part of what happens with drafting. You draft something, you read it through, your supervisor reads it through and says, ah, do you know what that is? I can't follow that, or that there's a jump in the logic there, and you go back and you revise it. So I think don't get into the idea that you can get it right first time. By being a self-critical reader, you can put yourself into the mind of your assessor and think, what will they make of this? What would I need to change to make it work for them? And I think it is this trial and error over time with lots of structure. I advise lots of structure, know what it is you're trying to do at any given point, and try to work to that and modify that as you need to. And I think, to my mind, this is that's the way to try and keep that cohesive and coherent.
Great. Another question gets more specific about not just reviewing people's empirical work. The question is, how do we use the lit review to establish our theoretical framework, and maybe a conceptual framework within it, and maybe an analytical framework? We might be going to use that, I guess, for analyzing findings. It's really about framing up conceptually the study and the place of a literature review there.
That's another really good question. And I think one of the things that happens is that when you start off working on your research, essentially you are reading for content. And as you read on, you start to realize that there's more than one way in which you might develop a theoretical orientation, because people have done different things. And also that there's more than one way in which you might investigate it, because people have used more than one different kind of methodological approach. And so you start to realize that you've got choices there. And one of the things that you can do, and it works really well using our templates, is that you can decide to go back and read something you've read before with a different answer to question A. So why am I reading this now? Is because I want to see what the theoretical orientation is. And you can go back to some of the key texts you've already got content out of and read them for theoretical orientation. And you come out with a whole set of different answers, which is really great. And then you can decide, then you might refer to the same literature in more than one place, according to what you're trying to answer. Is that kind of a rough answer, or did I miss half the question there?
No, I think it makes sense to me, and you will no doubt have feedback, which we can then respond to later. I think that's probably all we have time for in terms of questions. One thing I'd throw in is this is Mike's hot tip for you all to consider throughout your work. And this relates back to writing not just a cohesive text, but a persuasive text, one that expresses your individual voice as a self-critical writer contributing to academic discourse. And that's to consider using illustrative evidence to support all sorts of claims you make along the way, rather than no evidence at all. And what I mean by illustrative evidence is really one citation, as long as it's relevant, is better than no citations, or one brief quote from a text is worth more than none. An example of the second one, you might take the instance where you think the authors of a text have overgeneralized, then in half a sentence with a little quote, you can not just claim they've overgeneralized, but give a little quote where they say that this applies across the world, or even better, sometimes they don't put any qualifiers in. This is what I've found, and implicitly, this is going to apply to everyone. So think illustrative evidence all the way in your writing, even something short, is helping. It sort of drip feeds your critical reader with little bits of evidencing that help them to trust that you're being rigorous, thorough, you know what you're doing, a point that was made very early on in this presentation. And I hope you'll feel that that will really empower you, because you all do have something important to say. And I hope that our guidance can help you to achieve your dreams. Thanks very much.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you both very, very much. That was very, very helpful, even for someone who isn't writing a dissertation. I think there were tips that I could take from there. And the chat seems to be saying the same thing as well. Everyone is thanking you. So thank you very much both to Alison and Mike for your time. Thank you to all our attendees that took time out to come and spend time within this event. I hope you got something out of it. And as mentioned at the start, we will be sending out an email with the link to the YouTube video, the slides, as well as some of the questions that we didn't get to go through today that will be answered. So once again, thanks to everyone for coming. We hope you had a great presentation, and we hope to see you all soon. Goodbye. Take care.